Daniel Dennett was a big man in every way. Tall, upright, imposing build, massive intellect, big sense of humor, big-hearted generosity when crediting others, including those less gifted than himself. A formidably big gun in the attack against cant and pretension, superstition and illogic. Big books, eloquent speaker, deep knowledge of science as well as philosophy, talented musician and sculptor, lived a full life and died in harness. Leaves a huge gap in the world of the intellect. Dan will miss you so much, so deeply. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of grey ashes long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. As it happens, I was filmed having a conversation with him about death a few years ago, shortly after he recovered from a life-threatening condition. In addition to personal mortality, we discussed bereavement. I thought at this sad time it would be appropriate to listen again to his wisdom, the wisdom of a great thinker and a dear friend.
Dan, it's lovely to see you looking so fit and obviously pulled through so marvellously from your operation. But there's going to come a time when we don't pull through.
Yeah, what about that?
What about that? Do we get consolation from science, from Darwin, from what?
Well, I guess we do. A dear professor of mine just died just a few days ago, and I've been thinking quite a bit about it. And the idea that he lives for eternity in heaven doesn't give me any consolation at all. The idea that his memory lives on with his children and his friends and his colleagues. And of course, he has his work, or he had his work, which will live on. Not everybody gets that kind of legacy. And I think that for those that we love that die young or without that sort of issue, the best consolation is just that they had a chance. They got to be on this stupendous planet and live for a while, and they may have suffered. And I think seeing our suffering in the guise of the whole cosmos can make it seem not quite so earth-shatteringly special. Yeah, we suffer, but...
You're right, it is a consolation to have a few books behind one, or musical compositions or whatever. Or I suppose a great family life, and there are plenty of things of that sort. I'm rather moved by the astounding improbability of my own existence. When you think about the odds against our coming into existence, it is a huge privilege to be here. And I sort of feel that you want to say that when people say they're bored, you've no business to be bored. You exist. There are gazillions of people who could have existed in your place, and many of them would have been a lot better than you. So stop whinging. And the same thing when people bemoan their lot, or indeed bemoan the fact that life is going to come to an end. You're lucky to have had anything at all, is what I feel like saying to them. Stop moaning.
Exactly. And we're not filled with fear and trembling at the thought that there were all those years before we were alive. So it shouldn't bother us that there are going to be all those years when we're not alive.
Mark Twain, I think, said, I was dead for billions and billions of years before I was born and never suffered the slightest inconvenience.
Yeah, right, sure.
Of course, I wouldn't dream of saying stop whinging when somebody had just lost a loved one. If you've just lost your professor. There's something immensely precious about human friendship and human closeness. And to lose somebody can be like losing a limb. And so that very much doesn't come under my heading of stop whinging. Of course, you give thanks to what? You thank goodness for what they were and what they did and what they achieved and what they were to you. But of course you mourn them, you weep, you wish they were still here. But you get on with life. You face life, and you get on without them.
You know, I think gratitude is one of the wonderful human emotions and one of the great springs of, I think, a belief in God. You get up and you look around and you say, I'm so lucky to be alive.
And
this
you
is
want
so
to be grateful. You want to thank
I wish there was
something
somebody I could thank.
Yes, exactly.
And there's nobody to thank.
Yes.
And so you have to thank your lucky stars, and then you can think, well, at least I can make more reason for other people to be thankful.
Yes.
And that, I think, is the most positive response to the fact that there's nobody to accept our thanks.
I think we can do even better than that. We can say that given that there's nobody to thank, being able to reflect upon the process that gave rise to you is the nearest we can come to thanking. And it's actually rather better than thanking, because it's a thoughtful thing to do. It's an understanding, a comprehending thing to do. So you're not just kind of thanking your sky daddy. You're marveling in the fact that you are here, and the process that gave rise to you is the same process that gave rise to all these trees and the earth, and it's no accident that we are surrounded by an entire ecosystem. We couldn't exist without it. Thanking something can be sublimated into understanding how it all happened, and I think you get the same sort of comfort from that.
Not just comfort. I think awe. I think
exaltation.
Exactly. I think.
Yes.
Hallelujah.
Exactly.
It's just spectacular. It's so wonderful. And that sense of exaltation is, if anything, I think stronger in me because of my atheism than it would be if I were a believer.
Yes.
I see the universe itself as a thing which is not quite what Anselm said God was, a being greater than which nothing can be conceived. But certainly I can't think of anything greater than the universe. It's fantastic.
Yes, hallelujah for the universe and for the fact that we can understand it, or we're working on understanding it.
Well,
is in a way no worse than, as you said, what it was like before we were born, or having a anesthetic. I mean, you might say, dying is not going to be great, so why don't we just have a general anesthetic and stop when we're ready for it? However, when we're bereaved, when we lose a loved one, when we lose somebody who's really close, somebody who's been part of our life, that's terrible. There's no other way around it. It can be like losing a limb, and we have to get what comfort we can, and we can get it from remembering them, looking at their favorite poems, listening to their favorite music, things like that. I think there is comfort to be had from the thought that we're all part of the evolutionary process. It is a process of successive deaths over countless generations that is natural selection that has given rise to the way we are. We have plenty of time to anticipate it. Nothing will ever bring back the lost person, and I can imagine sort of howling with despair at the loss of somebody that I really love. But nevertheless, the buoying up effect of the reflection that we are lucky, they were lucky to have come into existence. If they're the sort of person we want to know, they will have left the world a better place anyway. We can give thanks again for them. I mean, give thanks to them for what they did.
Our grief is in effect a measure of how wonderful they were.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
You can't have the one without the other.
No.
And I think that reflection is always available. You think, I feel so terrible now. I'm just, as you say, howling with despair. That's how wonderful this
were.
life was.
Yes.
This how wonderful this is.
Yes.
And that's...
Yeah. We're also alone among animals in being able to say before we die, yes, this is why it was worth being born in the first place. It's not just that our improbability makes us thankful to be here because we are so improbable. We're also privileged, not just to be here, we're privileged to belong to the human species, because the human species really is rather unique. Among all animals, we are alone in knowing that we've got to die, and that's no fun, I suppose, to know to be able to foretell your end. But we're also unique in knowing why it was worth being born, coming into existence in the first place. Of course, it's hard dealing with grief and dealing with loss. There is some consolation to be had in the reflection of how privileged we are to be here at all. Statistically, we're so unlikely to exist. It's astonishingly unlikely that you and I exist, and yet we do. That's a privilege. But also we're privileged to belong to the human species, because the human species is unique in all sorts of ways. It's unique in knowing that our life is going to end, but we're also unique in knowing why it was worth coming into existence in the first place. Here we are, we find ourselves on this planet. It's like coming awake after an anesthetic. You open your eyes and you say, where am I? And you gradually learn where you are and you understand it. Because we're human and because we're scientists, we not only see where we are, we understand why we're here, and we owe it to our human history, the history of ideas, the history of philosophers, the history of scientists, perhaps in my case above all, Darwin. We now understand what it is that has brought us here, and that is a wonderful thought that goes a long way to removing the grief and the fear that as humans we inevitably also experience.
Richard, I like what you said at the end of Unweaving the Rainbow, and that is the book. Yes.
We can get outside the universe. I mean in the sense of putting a model of the universe inside our skulls, not a superstitious, small-minded, parochial model filled with spirits and hobgoblins, astrology and magic, glittering with fake crocks of gold where the rainbow ends. A big model, worthy of the reality that regulates, updates and tempers it. A model of stars and great distances, where Einstein's noble space-time curve upstages the curve of Yahweh's covenantal bow and cuts it down to size. A powerful model, incorporating the past, steering us through the present, capable of running far ahead to offer detailed constructions of alternative futures and allow us to choose. Peter and Jean Medower, in one of their books, said, "Only human beings guide their behavior by a knowledge of what happened before they were born and a preconception of what may happen after they are dead. Thus only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on." The spotlight passes, but exhilaratingly before doing so it gives us time to comprehend something of this place in which we fleetingly find ourselves, and the reason that we do so. We are alone among animals in foreseeing our end. We are also alone among animals in being able to say before we die, yes, this is why it was worth coming to life in the first place. Now, more than ever, seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. John Keats. A Keats and a Newton, listening to each other, might hear the galaxies sing.
Hallelujah.
That's the end of my book, Unweaving the Rainbow, which I wrote in 1998, which was a kind of attempt to convey the poetry of science. The title comes from Keats, who complained that Newton, by explaining the rainbow, by unweaving the rainbow, had removed all the poetry. And really the point of the book is that exact opposite is the case.
I think that's beautiful, Richard. In fact, I think we should probably try to gather more such wonderful passages together and treat them as part of the literature of science, of humanism, of the Enlightenment, and make them more available to people.
Actually, that's a wonderful idea. I mean, things like Carl Sagan,
Exactly.
Peter Atkins.
Right.
We could get. That would be a really nice sort of an anthology of scientific
hymns to the universe.
There's your title.
Yes. Yes. The universe is so wonderful on its own. It doesn't need a boss. It doesn't need a creator. The fact that it can, in effect, create itself is wonderful enough. And I can sometimes even get in a frame of mind where I think, well, probably in some dim way, that's what the human beings who've been worshiping God have been up to all along. They've felt the gratitude, they've felt the wonder, and they've thought, well, who do I thank? Who do I sing hymns to?
But the thought that you've just had couldn't. I mean, it had to wait until science came along to give us the understanding. It wouldn't have worked if they'd said, "Oh, well, I expect an explanation will come along someday. Isn't that wonderful?" There has to actually be the explanation, or at least the beginnings of it. We haven't finished yet, of course. There's a long way to go, but it's reached the stage now where we can actually grow out of the earlier kind of thanksgiving, and move on.
Many years ago, I was about to replant a hayfield, and my neighbor said, "Well, Dan, you should plant oats as a nurse crop, along with the timothy." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, a nurse crop like oats, it comes up first, and it's hardier, and it keeps the weeds down, and it protects the hay, the timothy, when it comes up. And once it's up, you can harvest the oats. You can do what you want with them, make oat hay."
So religion was the nurse crop.
Religion was the nurse crop for science, yes. And I think it's very possible that we would never have had science if we didn't have the sort of religious era first. And we can be grateful for those oats.
Yeah, nice point.
And now we've got science, and it's not clear that we need to plant any more oats.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.